Hey everyone, Dr. Steve here. You know it as well as I do, but most students need a B or better in A&P. But did you know that students are doing that all over the US using my Anatomy and Physiology Digital Suite as a low-cost alternative to expensive textbooks? Digital Suite delivers the key concepts of A&P with short, assignable tutor videos and a bulleted narrative study guide that not only explain the concepts of A&P, they show them happening. Combined with state-of-the-art dissection and physiology lab simulations and a vast question bank for quizzes, homework assignments, and exams, Digital Suite meets students where they are and gives them the tools to master the content. It's the perfect supplement to an OER textbook or just on its own. If you're an A&P instructor, contact your McGraw-Hill representative today and ask about Anatomy and Physiology Digital Suite. If you're a student, tell your instructor about it. There's a link to Digital Suite in the show notes of this episode. Get your B or better in A&P with A&P Digital Suite.
Every team, every topic, everywhere. This is Believe.
Hey everyone, welcome back to my podcast, Anatomy and Physiology Bit by Bit. I'm your host, Dr. Steve Sullivan, coming to you from Bucks County, Pennsylvania, just outside of Philadelphia, where I've been teaching A&P since 2002. Today's episode is a real special one. I got a really nice email about a couple of months ago from a listener who said she is a geneticist who is now working as a genetic counselor, and this podcast was helping her review A&P as she got deeper into the clinical side of genetics. Immediately, I started thinking, listener, this should be a guest. Genetic counseling is huge right now, and it plays a role in an enormous array of clinical scenarios. So I asked if she would like to be a guest on the show, and she graciously accepted. So today we're exploring an area of healthcare that sits right at the intersection of genetics, medicine, technology, and patient care, and that is genetic counseling. Now, as always, this and every episode of this podcast is for educational purposes only. In no way should anything you hear in this show be taken as medical advice. If you or someone you know is displaying any of the signs or symptoms mentioned in this podcast, please contact a medical professional immediately. Now, genetics has always been a fundamental part of anatomy and physiology. Our DNA influences everything from the proteins our cells produce to our susceptibility to certain diseases. But as genetic testing has become faster, more sophisticated, and increasingly available in clinical medicine, healthcare providers are faced with an important question. What do we actually do with all that genetic information? That's where genetic counselors play such an important role. Now, if you haven't listened to episode 79, Genetics for A&P, I recommend you do that. It will be a good background for this episode. Genetic counselors help patients and families understand how inherited and genomic information may affect their health. They help interpret genetic test results, assess the likelihood of inherited conditions, explain sometimes complicated concepts in understandable terms, and help patients make informed decisions about testing, treatment, screening, and family planning. And increasingly, genetic counseling is becoming relevant far beyond the traditional areas of prenatal genetics and inherited disorders. It now touches oncology, cardiology, neurology, pediatrics, pharmacology, and many other areas of healthcare. So my guest for this episode is Dr. Caralynn Wilczewski, a genetic counselor and Chief Laboratory Genetics and Genomics Fellow at the National Human Genome Research Institute within the National Institutes of Health. Yeah, if you're thinking what I'm thinking, how did I get this person on my show? This is an enormously impressive resume, and this conversation will not disappoint. Dr. Wilczewski earned her PhD in genetics and molecular biology from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill and her master's degree in genetic counseling through the joint program at Johns Hopkins University and the National Institutes of Health. In her current role, she provides genetic counseling and conducts clinical research using what is known as a genotype-first approach, with the goal of helping advance predictive genomic medicine. Rather than always beginning with a patient's symptoms and then searching for a genetic explanation, a genotype-first approach can begin with a particular genetic variant and then investigate how that variant may, or may not, manifest clinically. It represents an important shift in the way we think about the relationship between genes, disease, and potentially even disease prevention. In our conversation, Dr. Wilczewski and I discussed the fundamentals of genetics and genomics, what genetic counselors actually do, how genetic counseling is used in clinical practice, and how genetic testing is performed and interpreted. We also talk about what genetic information can tell us, what it sometimes can't tell us, and why interpreting a genetic test is often much more complicated than simply finding a mutation. This is an especially valuable conversation for anyone currently working in healthcare or preparing to enter a healthcare profession. Whether you're studying nursing, medicine, physician assistant studies, physical or occupational therapy, laboratory science, or another health-related field, there's an increasingly good chance that genetic information will become part of the patients you care for. Genomic medicine is no longer something that belongs exclusively to the future. It is a part of healthcare right now. So what exactly does a genetic counselor do? Who should consider genetic testing? How do clinicians determine whether a genetic variant is actually responsible for a disease? And how might genomics eventually allow us to predict disease before symptoms ever appear? We'll explore all of that and much more. So without further ado, here is my conversation with Dr. Caralynn Wilczewski of the National Institutes of Health on genetics, genetic testing, and the rapidly evolving field of genetic counseling. Okay, Dr. Caralynn Wilczewski from the NIH, thank you for joining us. To begin, would you mind telling the listeners who you are and what you do?
Sure. So my name is Dr. Caralynn Wilczewski. I'm a genetic counselor at the National Institutes of Health and the National Human Genome Research Institute, where I'm a genetic counselor and clinical researcher.
That's really interesting. About 15 years ago, I did a short little bioinformatics course that I was learning a little bit about that, and we talked a lot about the Human Genome Project and how people had donated their computer power. So because it took so much CPU power that people would allow their computers to be used online so that they could map out the human genome. Did you ever hear about that?
I did not realize people are also donating their own computing power to it, but that makes a lot of sense. I mean, it was a ginormous effort that took a lot of people and a lot of resources, and now we get to reap the benefits from it. So that's pretty cool.
I saw an interview with Francis Collins once, and it was really, really impressive. He kind of headed up that Human Genome Project back in the 80s and 90s. Pretty impressive. Anyway.
Very impressive guy.
Yeah, for sure. So you're a genetic counselor. I'm sure that a lot of the listeners have heard that term before because you hear it a lot right now. But what specifically does a genetic counselor do for patients and their families?
So genetic counselors are hopefully trying to be kind of like the translators of genetics, but then also counselors. It's kind of a two-part profession. So we try to help people learn, understand, but then also adapt to having or being at risk for a genetic condition. So it's both the genetics and health condition piece, but then also the counseling. So a lot of times we're talking with people who have a health condition or at risk for a health condition based on family history to figure out whether they want to know through genetic testing, whether they have a genetic cause for their condition, how they might cope or are currently dealing with their risk for a genetic condition or having a genetic disease, and then also kind of how they are adapting to that process of having a genetic condition, or they may have a child with a genetic condition. So how kind of the whole family is adapting, and how their caregiving is going, whether they want to have more kids, kind of all of that is encompassed in it. And we get to talk to a lot of people because genetic conditions are actually a lot more common than people think. Most pregnant people will talk to a genetic counselor or interact with genetics in some way during pregnancy. About 1 in 250 people in the United States are actually at risk for familial or family high cholesterol. And sickle cell disease is also a genetic condition that affects about 100,000 people in the US. So we get to interact with people at lots of different life stages in lots of different ways.
Yeah, for sure. I have an episode on genetics, but it's like genetics for A&P. It is episode 79, if anyone wants to go back and listen to it. I'm sure that it is surface scratching at the most superficial level when it comes to genetics, because I do not have any kind of genetics background. So if it doesn't apply to introductory A&P, I do not really have a good background on it, which is why I'm so glad to have someone like you on the show. We actually had a couple of episodes recently on some genetic conditions. One that comes to mind is Ehlers-Danlos syndrome. I had a occupational therapist who specializes in Ehlers-Danlos and has Ehlers-Danlos, and we talked about the 13 different kinds of conditions that are under the umbrella of Ehlers-Danlos, which is a genetic thing. So that's kind of interesting. What inspired you to become a genetic counselor, and what kind of education and training do you need to do that?
I have to tune into your Ehlers-Danlos, but I'm glad you did an episode on it because that is one that frequently people interact with genetics for too. But I did listen to your genetics episode for the like kind of intro part of A&P, and I thought it was very good. So great job.
Oh, good. Whew, I was starting to sweat.
But in order to become a full genetic counselor, people need to start with a bachelor's degree, usually in psychology or biology or genetics, but something kind of in that realm. And then you have to go and do a 2-year master's degree specifically in genetic counseling. Once you finish that, you have to pass a boards exam. That's a national standardized test, kind of showing what you know. And then in some cases, you also have to get a license to practice, but it kind of varies state to state whether you actually need that license.
And now you're with the National Institutes of Health, so that's a government entity. But I know that there's also genetic counselors that work at hospitals, for example, in Philadelphia, Fox Chase Cancer Center, right? So if someone has a cancer diagnosis or a close relative has a cancer diagnosis, they might see a genetic counselor in that aptitude as well. So where, I mean, it sounds like we can find genetic counselors in multiple different places.
Yeah, definitely. We're slowly kind of infiltrating across all aspects of healthcare because we're learning so much more. I mean, partly thanks to the Human Genome Project, that genetics can play a role in many, many, many different types of conditions. So definitely cancer is a really big one because we are so familiar with thinking about hereditary risk for certain types of cancer, like breast cancer and the BRCA1 and 2 genes, Lynch syndrome, and family kind of risk for colorectal cancer. Another big one is certainly prenatal. So when people are either pregnant or thinking about getting pregnant, thinking about what conditions may run in, both sides of the family and thinking about whether baby might be at risk for a genetic condition. Cardio is also starting to be another big specialty that there are starting to be a lot of genetic counselors in. Things like hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, which is a heart muscle disease where your heart muscle gets a lot thicker. That can come from an inherited risk. That's a big one. But then there are also neuro conditions. There are genetic counselors in primary care now. And then there are also dedicated genetics clinics that see both kids and adults. And that's where there's also a lot of genetic counselors who work really closely with genetics doctors who are called medical geneticists.
Wow. I have a friend who's an evolutionary geneticist, which I always thought was very cool. Yeah, really fun to talk to him. He was actually on the podcast a few years ago.
That would be cool. That's the evolutionary stuff and the phylogenetic trees, those are very complex.
It seems like when we talk about evolution, the genetics just shows you exactly the map, right? The genetics shows you the map better than a fossil record would show you the map. If it's all hereditary, then it's all coming back to genetics. So I did a couple episodes that I called Mythbusters in A&P because there's a lot of myths in A&P. I would imagine that if you did a Mythbusters in genetics, one of the first things that would come up would be the term junk DNA. Because I hear that, and I think for people at my level who teach a clinical anatomy and physiology course to maybe future nurses or physical therapists and things like that, we read in the textbooks that 2% of the nucleotides actually code for proteins, and then the rest is just junk. And that can't be true, right? Right? So the 98% is still doing something. What is that?
Yeah, you see me waving my hands like, no, it's not junk.
Yeah, right, for sure.
So there are a lot of things in there that we don't understand yet, but some that we do. Other parts of those kind of non-protein coding parts of our DNA are helping to regulate those protein coding genes. So controlling when they're turned on and off, for example, because say you have a gene that encodes for a protein that's really important for heart muscles cells. You don't want that gene to be turned on inappropriately in like a nerve cell, right? You want that nerve cell dedicating all of its energy to making nerve cell proteins. And so those regions in between the protein coding genes help to kind of regulate and turn on those actual protein coding genes on and off where they should be and turn them off where they shouldn't be. So that is a really important part of that. I'll call it non-coding rather than junk DNA. And then other parts are also helping to code for RNA. So this is something I think you covered back in your genetics episode, right? We have our central dogma where we have the DNA gets transcribed to RNA, which is like the little message. And then that RNA ends up getting translated into protein. Sometimes it gets transcribed into the message or just RNA, and that RNA can do special jobs within the cell. It can turn genes off. It can regulate some of the actual messenger RNA that may otherwise get translated to proteins. Some of it also encodes for the kind of machinery that helps build that protein. So that's really important. And then there's also sections of our DNA that can actually copy themselves and move throughout the genome. So they're called transposons, or more kind of layman's terms, some people might call them jumping genes. And so these can enrich our genome or our whole DNA for diversity because they're kind of moving things around and switching things up. And people think that they're actually kind of relics of old viruses that infected humans really, really, really long time ago and have just kind of gotten stuck.
I love that.
Yeah, it's pretty cool. So that's another thing that's in this kind of junk, maybe, but that we don't quite understand exactly why they're sticking around. But yeah, so lots of other things in that other 98% that are really important for how our cells are able to use our DNA, even if it doesn't code for protein directly.
I love the virus story. I love the idea that we might actually be part ancient virus. And, and I think that story is great. When I cover mitochondria with my students, and we talk about the fact that mitochondria itself has its own phospholipid bilayer and DNA, and it's like, guess what? It was probably its own single-celled organism one day that we started collaborating with. Epic collab of our, now we have mitochondria. So I love those ancient stories that kind of tell us where we came from.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's something to talk with your evolutionary biologist friend about.
Yes, and he better be listening. Only he listens. So a lot of A&P students, they learn about DNA, the chromosomes, mitosis, meiosis, transcription, translation, things like that. Which of these foundational concepts are most important in your daily work, and how do they translate into actual patient care?
So it really depends on who I'm talking to that day and who my patients are, because a really important aspect of genetic counseling is being able to tailor the conversation to what that person in front of you needs. We're not just kind of chat robots who are saying the same thing to every person. It really depends on what their concerns are, and we try to have a good back and forth to give that person what they need out of this genetic counseling appointment. So for example, say I'm talking to a person who has a heart condition, and we did genetic testing and found they have a genetic variant or a misspelling in their DNA that's causing their heart condition. They may want to know what is the risk for their child to have inherited that genetic variant and also develop the heart condition. So in that case, we might focus more on the inheritance piece than like the genetic mechanism, because they really want to know specifically what's the risk for them to pass on that variant to their kid. But we will then cover, whether it's one single genetic misspelling that's causing the heart condition or whether it needs to be two in combination. But then we will also cover the fact that, we don't control what genes we pass on to our kids and engage in some of that more counseling aspect of it to know that it's outside of your control, whether your kid ends up developing it or not, it was certainly not your fault. But if I'm seeing another person, say for like prenatal genetic counseling, then we're going to be focusing more on chromosomes specifically and meiosis. And that's because most patients come in for prenatal genetic counseling, specifically for prenatal screening for a condition like Down syndrome, where we have one extra chromosome that causes this condition. People may have too few chromosomes, and a lot of that is sussed out during prenatal genetic testing. So in that case, then I really might be talking to patients about meiosis and how we have these packages of DNA, and sometimes as we're making our egg cells or our sperm cells, the packages of DNA don't divide into each cell evenly, and sometimes that can give rise to a baby with too many or too few chromosomes. So there we're kind of more working on the actual like genetic material and meiosis more so than like inheritance patterns, because those tend to be sporadic and not inherited. It really depends on what the person that I'm talking to wants to know.
And many of them probably have little to no scientific background. So how do you explain like complex topics like penetrance or variable expressivity or multifactorial inheritance or things that are co-dominant or, things like that? How do you explain that to someone who, has no scientific background, for example?
Yeah, it's a great question. And this is one of the hardest things I think to learn and also to teach new genetic counselors and students, because we learn about all of these things in textbooks using words like inheritance and codominance and penetrance, but you have to talk to that person like you're a person and they're a person and you're not a textbook. And so it's really important for genetic counselors to be good communicators and translators to avoid using that jargon and kind of work with the person at the level that they're coming into the appointment. So it always starts by asking the patient how much they know and also how much they want to know, because I could talk about genetics all day, but that patient might not really want to talk about the really minute details all day long. So once we kind of get into what they want to know, if they want to know, okay, well, my dad has this genetic variant and he has this genetic condition. We just did genetic testing. We found I had the genetic variant. What are the chances I actually get this disease? We say that not everyone who has the genetic variant or misspelling necessarily gets the condition. And that's how I would explain penetrance, right? I don't use the word penetrance. I just explain the concept. Or if there are many people in the family and they want to know, like, okay, am I going to end up looking exactly like my dad who has this condition? We say not everyone with the condition develops the same symptoms, even within the same family. And that's how we would explain variable expressivity without using those big, long, complicated words. Because once you start to use those words, it really can turn people off from hearing the rest of the conversation, because they tend to get a little bit overwhelmed by the amount of information. And so it's important to try to relate it back to words and concepts that they may already know. So analogies can also be really helpful. Like I keep saying genetic misspellings rather than genetic variant or mutation. I talk about chromosomes, like these packages of DNA, and how we inherit the different packages that we need to build our cells and build our bodies. So those tools can all be really helpful.
Yeah, and that's really smart in being relatable to the patient and keeping them comfortable and, like you said, not kind of spiraling in their own head down this rabbit hole of big words, because it can be super scary. And in healthcare, we use these big unnecessary words all the time. I was discussing this with someone recently. We were talking about the term idiopathic myalgia. And someone finds out they have idiopathic myalgia. They're like, oh my goodness, what is that? And I'm like, it means your muscle hurts and we don't know why. like that's what that whole big term means. And there's actually like a diagnosis code for that. We need to stop scaring people.
Yeah. There's a time to like show off how much you know, but when you're talking to a patient, that is not that time, right?
Right, for sure.
You don't need to impress them with your big brain. You need to explain things in a way that they are able to ingest it, process it, and then be able to use it. And hopefully also then go and explain it to their family member or, their spouse or whomever they're going to for support or to share the news about this genetic risk.
So, what are the major types of genetic tests that are currently used in healthcare?
So there are quite a few. The big one that we think of most commonly is sequencing, which is kind of spelling out the letters in the DNA one by one and then analyzing them to look for misspellings. So that catches a good proportion of the genetic testing that's done right now, and we're learning many different ways to use that sequencing data, including looking for, as we're spelling out all of the DNA, can we look for chunks that are missing or extra? And within sequencing, there's different flavors of ways to do that. There's exome or genome sequencing, which exome is where we're spelling out just those, kind of 2% protein coding regions of the genome that we talked about. Genome sequencing is where we're going to try to sequence almost all of your DNA in one go. And so, as you can imagine, that generates a massive amount of information, which can then take quite a lot of time and computer power and brain power to process and try to find those disease-causing variants that could explain someone's healthcare. You can also do panel tests where you're just kind of sequencing or spelling out a specific number of genes that you already think could be associated with the health condition the person has. But then there are other types of genetic tests. There are these things called arrays, where we're taking someone's DNA, chopping it up into little pieces in the tube, and then applying it to a slide to see if we can find chunks that are missing or extra. And then there's also these things called karyotypes, which are kind of old school, but still very, very useful, where we're actually taking cells in a dish, growing them up, cracking them open, and then looking for how many packages of DNA or chromosomes a person has, and whether any of those pieces of DNA are swapped around between those different chromosomes. So those are just a few of the different tests, but there are more coming out all the time.
Yeah, that's awesome. I can imagine that this is an enormous field in research right now. So, when I'm in my class and I talk about genetics and I talk about neoplasias or something like that, I bring up mutations. Sometimes when the DNA replicates, it doesn't get copied exactly the way it was before. So, I guess my question is, and this seems probably super basic for you, but if, for example, cytosine will only bind to guanine and adenine to thymine, how do we get the misspelling?
Yeah, great question. So ideally, right? Adenine to thymine, cytosine to guanine, they match up perfectly like little puzzle pieces, and we don't have any mistakes. But the proteins responsible for doing that copying of DNA or replication can sometimes have mistakes. And those mistakes should be caught by other machinery that is like the proofreader following behind the copying machinery. But sometimes those proofreaders are also broken or not working correctly. And if that happens, then that mistake or misspelling can persist in that cell. If that mistake or misspelling was in a protein that's important for cell growth or for making sure the cell dies when it's supposed to, then that kind of persistent misspelling can induce the cell to grow more, divide more, and then that can lead to cancer. So it requires multiple mistakes, but we have countless cells in our body. These mistakes kind of happen all the time. Hopefully the proofreading mechanism catches it, but not always. And in fact, there's one hereditary cancer syndrome called Lynch syndrome, where that proofreading machinery is broken or mutated, and it doesn't work as well as it should. When that happens, those people are more prone to develop cancer and at younger ages, specifically colorectal cancer, but they can also get many, many, many other types of cancer. So our cells are complicated little things. And
Yeah.
you can imagine it should operate as a finely tuned machine, but sometimes it doesn't.
So, would it be the case that maybe a thymine binds to a guanine somehow?
Mhm.
Like the binding points in the molecule and the pyrimidine and the purine get altered so that they can actually have an affinity for each other? I mean, they're just hydrogen bonds, right? So they're the weakest of the bonds. So I guess it's probably not that hard to do.
Mm-hmm. Not that hard to do to kind of get that little 2 hydrogen bond to 3 hydrogen bond kind of mispairing blip. But then when that repair machinery comes in for the proofreading part, it may not know which was the original base and which one it should keep and which one it should fix. And sometimes it might fix the wrong one, and we keep the mistake and we get rid of the correct original base. So that's another way the mistake can just continue to persist.
Okay, great. Thank you for clearing that up. That's important because that's now going into my class. It's a great way to explain it. So the genetic test results are not always a clear positive or negative. You kind of mentioned already that just because this showed up doesn't mean that you're going to have this condition, this same condition that your family has. How do you help patients and healthcare professionals understand uncertain findings, such as a variant of uncertain significance or a result that increases risk without guaranteeing that that disease will develop?
So I'm just going to make a distinction here. When someone knows that they have like a familial risk for a disease, say, for example, their mom got breast cancer at 40, got genetic testing, had a BRCA1 variant, which we know increases the risk for breast cancer and ovarian cancer and pancreatic cancer. If her son or daughter wanted to get genetic testing for that genetic misspelling, they would be tested probably just for that one single variant, and they would be either positive or negative. They would either have the variant putting them at risk or they don't, and then they're just at population risk for those types of cancer. If they are positive, then there's still some uncertainty with whether or not they'll develop cancer, but we know they have the variant. On the other hand, if someone may have a connective tissue disorder and they want to get genetic testing to figure whether they have a genetic type of connective tissue disorder, what their causative kind of genetic misspelling is, then there are three types of results they could get. They could get a positive, where we find a genetic misspelling that we know is causing particular connective tissue disease. They could get a negative, where we are unable to find a genetic variant causing their disease right now. That doesn't mean it's not genetic. It means we couldn't find an answer at this moment. Or they could get the third type of result that you mentioned called a variant of uncertain significance. That's where we found a genetic misspelling in a gene associated with connective tissue disease, but we don't have enough information yet to know for sure that it is causing connective tissue disease or whether it is not, because we all have genetic misspellings that are different compared to everybody else in the population. That's part of what makes the human race so diverse. But it can be hard for us to have enough scientific information to know whether that misspelling is causing disease or if we could put it in the benign, not causing disease bucket. When someone ends up with one of those variants of uncertain significance, it can be tough. We need to know kind of the context of their clinical history. How suspicious are we that that gene really fits with their clinical picture? Can we do testing within their family members to see whether that genetic misspelling tracks with other family members who also have the disease? That increases our suspicion that that variant of uncertain significance may actually be causing disease. And so that's how we can kind of hopefully come to a better resolution, whether that what we call VUS is causing disease or not. But other times we can't. And that's where the counseling piece of being a genetic counselor really comes in, helping someone kind of understand just intellectually, okay, variant of uncertain significance, we're not going to use this to alter your healthcare, but it's something we should just be aware of and maybe keep tabs on in case we end up with more information 5-10 years down the line that this disease is causing or not. But then also that can be a really uncomfortable place to sit in, right? When you have this uncertainty, you didn't really get an answer, but you sort of did, and you really were looking for one. And so that's where it's important to work with that person to help them process what were they hoping to get out of genetic testing? What are they hoping to get out of their healthcare? And can we still kind of achieve some of their goals to help them manage their healthcare and manage their life with this condition, even if we aren't able to give them like a nice, tidy genetic answer for why they've developed this condition?
Right. So in some cases, it's going to alter the clinical management of a disease, and in some cases, it might not.
Yeah. And that's why it's quite tricky for patients because I think everybody wants a genetic answer when they do genetic testing, right? It's like, I paid for this thing. I want to get something out of it.
Yeah.
But, on the other hand, if you do genetic testing, like, do you want to find out that you have this, high risk for a hereditary type of cancer or not? Like, sometimes people can find relief in getting those VUSs that we may not chase after or coming back negative. It really is person to person, which is why, like I said, it's so important to tailor how you're communicating and how you're working with that individual in front of you.
Yeah, and that probably brings up some ethical and emotional challenges in genetic counseling as well. So, I mean, knowing that something's going to affect biological relatives, reveal unexpected family relationships, and then are those people going to tell those other people and things like that? And being an adoptive parent, we have really no idea. We did a 23andMe, which was one of the things he asked for Christmas one year. And so we have, we get some cursory things from that about like, oh, you have a higher risk for dry skin, or like one of them was like hair on your back, things like that. It told him a lot of different things, but ultimately, unless like we have real stuff from his biological parents, we really don't know. But it is kind of interesting because this is something important. So I recently had prostate cancer, and I was treated at Fox Chase Cancer Center in Philadelphia, and they brought up the genetic counseling and testing like within weeks after the surgery, and they're like, we should do this. And I was like, you know what, I agree we should do this, but I'm going to recover from this part first and get that all, settled. And everything's totally fine now. But, my biological son knows he's going to start getting his PSA checked way earlier than most people because my dad had it too. So yes, we talked about like the emotional challenges, and it's not for everybody. I'm definitely going to do it. I just wanted to get through the hard part first before we started doing that. So, but they were great there, like fantastic. In fact, my surgeon, I interviewed him recently for the podcast, and we talked about urologic cancers and things like that. So it's people usually don't get too far past me before I ask them if they want to be on the podcast. I mean, you sent me one email, and my next one was like, you want to be on? So as soon as I find someone who I think it has an impressive background, I'm going to ask them. So as genetic testing becomes more accessible and personalized medicine continues to grow, what should future and current healthcare professionals understand about the benefits, limitations, privacy concerns, and potential misuse of genetic information?
Yeah, those are a lot of really important questions that I think we should all be thinking about, both like healthcare providers, which I know a lot of your students are thinking about becoming involved in healthcare in some regard, but then also as consumers. These are all things that we should be giving a lot of thought to. I would say for people who are not yet super in depth in genetics, which I hope after listening to this, everybody is like, I definitely want to get into genetics. But it's important to remember that genetics is a really valuable tool, but it is not a crystal ball. So it gives the patient an opportunity to know a little bit of information to help control the things that they can, because, for a lot of conditions, there are some modifiable things people can do to maintain control over their health, or genetics can kind of point them in the right direction to try to keep them as healthy as possible. For example, if a baby's born, they're really not doing well after birth, we do genetic testing, find out they have a particular metabolic condition. Okay, we know what diet they need to be on and what things they absolutely must avoid.
Like PKU.
But exactly, just like PKU. I think you might have mentioned PKU in your in the genetics episode, but that's a great example.
It's a real easy one for an A&P instructor to use as an example, because it's like so cut and dry, and I think it's like real simple in dominance and recessive for like a good Punnett square. So it's a real easy one to go through. Anyway, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
Yeah, well, and a lot of people find out about PKU because it's on this thing called the newborn screen. So most babies are after they're born, they get their heel pricked, and they find out if they have PKU before you have those really devastating kind of like neurologic consequences if they aren't on the right diet. So It's a valuable tool, but it's not a crystal ball. There are some conditions where it is a bit more direct and cut and dry like that, like PKU, but for others, it's not. Like one of the heart conditions that I mentioned, the thickening of the heart muscle or hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, with a lot of the genetic variants connected to that, we can say, okay, you might have an increased risk of developing this, but that doesn't mean that you're going to. But now that we know you have inherited this variant, you are at increased risk, you should be getting regular screenings. If we notice, your heart muscle is starting to get thicker, here are the medications that we can put you on to try to decrease the strain of the heart before it gets too thick and before the heart is in like a lot of trouble. So really valuable tool, not always a crystal ball, doesn't always mean a person is going to develop the condition, but really, really useful. So it's not one of those things that should be ignored either, because typically if someone is getting genetic testing, like there's a reason, and that individual, their providers should really consider it, especially for people like primary care docs, nurse practitioners, PAs. Like they've got a lot on their plate. They have a lot of, they're kind of taking care of the whole person, but it's one thing that I think is great. That's where you can pull in other providers to maybe know a little bit more, like a genetic counselor.
Yeah.
Um,
And how much genetics are you actually getting in med school?
Oh my gosh, I heard from a friend who went to medical school that he got 1 day. And I was like, oh my gosh, this hurts my heart, because this was after I had done a PhD in genetics. And then I was in the middle of genetic counseling school. And I just thought, oh no. But I will say, he said they only got 1 day of genetics, but the day ended with their professor just repeating to them, you just need to hire a good genetic counselor. And I was like, yes, you do.
There you go. Yep. Yeah. Know your limits.
Yes, exactly.
For
I think
sure.
that's really important.
So one of my favorite stories to tell in my class, just because it's so easy to show natural selection and evolution, is the sickle cell anemia. The consequence for people who carry it versus people who actually express the sickle cell anemia. So if they're heterozygous for it, they are resistant to the parasite that causes malaria.
Mm-hmm.
And which is a huge survival advantage in the equatorial regions where this disease is basically found.
Mm-hmm.
That's a real fun one for me. And I understand it on a very limited, that's it. What I just told you is how much I understand it.
That's an excellent place to start. But yeah, I think that's that's another great one to help people understand why we still have genetic conditions, right? Sometimes being a heterozygote or only having one copy of the genetic variant can actually help you. It's when you have two that can be the problem. Or, sometimes when people have one genetic variant, they might not realize they have the condition until they've already had kids. And so these things just keep getting passed down through the generations. And yeah, it's fascinating thinking about how did we end up here? And yeah.
Right. I tell my students all the time, evolution only cares if you live long enough to have kids.
Mm-hmm.
That's it. After that, couldn't care less what happens to you. As long as you pass the genes on. Well, you've been super generous with your time and expertise. I want to thank you so much, Dr. Carrie Wilczewski. Do you have anything else you want to share, something I didn't think to ask you think would be really important for the listeners?
I think I would just say, if you really love science and you're learning about genetics in your classes, I would definitely encourage everybody to consider genetic counseling. I think it's a great way to get that patient interaction that a lot of people want to get, and you can directly help people. I know what inspired me to become a genetic counselor was I was in my PhD in genetics, and I was volunteering and doing a lot of science outreach. I had made these 3D printed models of congenital heart disease, and at a science fair, grandmother and her grandson actually walked up, and she was like, look, my grandson had this congenital heart disease. And I was like, oh my gosh, this is a great opportunity for me to help teach somebody and help them kind of better understand their own health. And I think genetic counseling is a great way to do that, right? You kind of give people the opportunity to look under the hood at their DNA, see what's going on, and then help them use that information to preserve and advance their own health. So if you like talking to people, you are compassionate and empathetic and enjoy kind of helping people work through their problems, and you love science, genetic counseling is a great field. And there's a lot of great resources through the National Society of Genetic Counselors website, nsgc.org, where prospective genetic counselors can go on there and learn more about the field, and then talk to other genetic counselors. Don't just listen to me. Go find other people near you and kind of understand their career journey. I know that was really helpful when I was trying to figure out how I wanted to use genetics to help people.
Well, that's great. I'll put a link to all that stuff in the show notes. So if someone wants to go on and look more at what the NIH does and also the genetic counseling site, I will put all of that in the show notes so everyone can take a look. And I'm going to say this for all the listeners out there: if your college offers a genetics course, take it.
Please do.
I mean, everything is coming down to genetics, and we're understanding so much more about it now than when I was an undergrad in the early 90, that's how early 90s, when I was an undergrad. And I never took a genetics course because my track of bio was exercise physiology and it wasn't required, so I never took it. And I really, really wish that I had taken more genetics as a student. I think I would understand so much more about people in healthcare now.
Our DNA underlies everything. So I also agree. Take genetics. It will be nothing but helpful to you.
Yes. Thank you so much. I really appreciate you coming on.
Of course. Thanks so much for having me.
Once again, thank you to Dr. Caralynn Wilczewski of the National Human Genome Research Institute for sharing your wealth of knowledge and expertise on this incredibly important field in healthcare. I will post a link to Dr. Wilczewski's LinkedIn account in case you want to learn more about her work and maybe even ask her a question. I'll also post a link to genome.gov, the website for the National Human Genome Research Institute, in case you're interested in learning more about that. I want to thank you all for listening. I really hope you enjoyed this episode, and as always, I hope this podcast is helping you get your B or better in A&P. Good luck, be well, and I will talk to you next time. Anatomy and Physiology Bit by Bit is a production of Minus 55 Media and is hosted by the Believe Network. Please take the time to rate the podcast and leave a review. You can also check out the content I post on Instagram and YouTube as @StudentHelp4AP. That's StudentHelp, the number 4, AP. Special thanks to my family, Bucks County Community College, and McGraw-Hill Education, where your instructor can find Anatomy and Physiology Digital Suite, my low-cost, tutor video-based digital learning solution for anatomy and physiology, currently being used at several colleges and universities. If your instructor isn't using Digital Suite, let them know about it. The link is in the show notes.
If you like the show, please take a moment to rate, review, and subscribe. It really does help the show to grow. Thank you for listening.